On behalf of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute and the History program, it's my special pleasure to welcome you here tonight for the first presentation of our lecture series on how to write global histories this semester, organized in cooperation with the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute. My name is Martin Klimke, and I'm the head of the History program here at NYU Abu Dhabi. We are especially delighted to welcome Professor Sebastian Conrad from the Free University of Berlin here tonight. As you certainly know by now, the aim of this lecture series is to explore the various ways of writing global history by employing perspectives from a plethora of geographical locations to allow for new narratives of encounters and entanglements across the globe. Professor Conrad, whom we have the pleasure of seeing here at NYU Abu Dhabi for the very first time, has been one of the pioneers and leading proponents of this application of global perspectives to the past. Since 2010, Professor Conrad has been professor for modern history at the Freie University of Berlin in Germany. From 2007 to 2010, he held a professorship at the European University Institute in Florence. In addition, he was a professeur invité at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris and a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. Professor Conrad is also an extremely prolific writer. His ever-growing publication list boasts no less than 19 books, co-edited volumes, and journal issues, 22 articles, and 38 book chapters. And when I mentioned these numbers last night in my introduction of him during our research seminar, he was actually worried that people might think that these numbers are inflated or evidence of a lax and quick production style that is devoid of the seriousness and quality of academic research. Now, I can vouch that none of this is the case, and I'm sure tonight's talk will be further evidence of this. At a time when many of his colleagues in Germany were still primarily interested in examining historical events from within the confines of a national perspective, Professor Conrad's works broke new ground and established global as well as transnational history as a legitimate mode of inquiry in the German Academy. His first book, which came out in German in 1999 and was translated into English in 2008, was published as The Quest for the Lost Nation, Writing History in Germany and Japan in the American Century by the University of California Press. His second book, originally published in 2006, came out in 2010 with Cambridge University Press as Globalization and the Nation in Imperial Germany. Following this pattern, his third book, German Colonialism, A Short History, came out in 2012, and his most recent work, which appeared only last year in German and is entitled Global History, an Introduction, will undoubtedly also find an English publisher soon. Professor Conrad's efforts to situate Imperial Germany, among other things, within a global context and overcome a Eurocentric view in historiography has not only gathered international praise inside the Academy, but has also won wide acclaim along with some prestigious prizes among the general public. He won the Dissertation Award of the Ernst Reuter Society in 1999, the Philip Morris Research Award in 2007, and was featured by the German magazine Der Spiegel as one of the most outstanding scientists in the year of the humanities. His works have also inspired a whole new generation of historians to critically examine popular notions of globalization and reevaluate traditional national narratives, highlighting transnational connections, networks, and experiences, as well as their repercussions on national identity and politics. And we are therefore particularly happy that he could join us tonight and share his views on the Enlightenment in global history. So without any further ado, I shall now pass the mic to Professor Conrad for what I'm sure will be a very stimulating presentation. Professor Conrad, thank you very much for coming. We are very much looking forward to your talk tonight.
All right, thank you, Martin. Thank you for welcoming me. Thank you for bringing me here in the first place. And thanks to all of you in particular for coming here tonight. The fact that so many of you are here means that the Enlightenment is alive and kicking in Abu Dhabi at least. That's good news. It'll be very historical, though, what I'll be saying in the next 45 minutes or so. Yes, it'll be about the Enlightenment in global history. And actually, if you think about the way in which the Enlightenment is usually placed in global history, it is seen typically as one of the crucial, the pivotal events of modern history. But its story is quickly told. The story of the Enlightenment is such that it's usually assumed that the Enlightenment originates somewhere in the depth of European history with humanism and the Renaissance, and then sort of develops into a fully fledged Enlightenment in the 18th century. And everything that we consider as modern, the modern individual, modern society, reason, the disenchantment of the world, as Max Weber famously put it, derived from there. And then it was then sent out into the world and disseminated to everyone else. This is William McNeill, if you will, the grandfather of global history. And he famously summarized like this: "We and all the world of the 20th century are peculiarly the creatures and heirs of a handful of geniuses of early modern Europe." I know from a conversation last night that William McNeill himself probably thought of himself as a genius, but nevertheless, all of us are definitely heirs of this tradition. Now, this is in some ways, and in many ways, very stereotypical and Eurocentric interpretation of the Enlightenment that I would like to challenge. And to give you a sense of what I'll be trying to say tonight in this talk, here are the three major messages, if you will. One is Enlightenment debates are, in the 18th century and beyond, responses to challenges posed by a situation in which people find themselves living in an increasingly globalizing world. Second, Enlightenment in the 18th century already was not the work of Europeans alone, but had many authors in many places. We'll come to that. And third, and this is, I guess, the most provocative statement vis-a-vis existing Enlightenment scholarship, the history of the Enlightenment did not end with the French Revolution or in 1800, as is typically assumed, but rather extended into the 19th century and changed as a result of that longer history. All right? So if you find nothing of that interesting, I guess that'll be it, right? So feel free to leave. But if you're curious, I'd be happy to engage in a conversation with you. If indeed the Enlightenment has a longer history that extends throughout the 19th century, and of course we could say extends throughout the 20th century as well, if it has a history and that history matters, then that means that it's not a good idea to depart with a narrow definition of what Enlightenment actually means. As you know, historians for decades and centuries, in fact, have pondered the question, what is Enlightenment, and have tried to define and limit the meaning of the term, beginning with probably Immanuel Kant in 1784 with his famous question, was ist Aufklärung? And historians ever since have engaged with this issue. Let me, by way of an example, quote just one person engaging with this question. He's not a historian, but rather an artist, a Japanese artist, who roughly 100 years after Immanuel Kant's question gave this answer. This is a woodblock print entitled The Rise of Enlightenment and the Fall of Tradition. And in this woodblock print, he depicts, let me see if this works, he depicts the battle between the old and the new. So you see, for example, let's see, you see a modern chair subduing a traditional stool. You see a modern, if you will, modern umbrella defeating a traditional parasol. You see a modern modern pen defeating a traditional brush, and so forth and so forth. You see the old defeated by the new, the whole process driven by, let's see, here we go, by the locomotive, the steam engine that drives modernity in the 19th century pretty much around the world, the symbol of the modern. And in the center of this print, you see, here you see a modern gas lantern defeating a candle, lightening or enlightening, if you will, everything that seemed still dark in 1870s Japan. Now this is one answer to Kant, but what strikes us as an immediate peculiarity is that everything that Kant assumed seems to be turned on its head here. And in particular, I refer to the fact that for Kant, it was clear that if reason is only given freedom, it will, by nature, as a quasi-natural phenomenon, then be liberated. Here we see nothing of that. Here the victory of the Enlightenment over its enemy tradition is one that needs force, needs violence. This is a battle between the old and the new. This is not mankind's exit out of self-incurred immaturity. No, this is the new defeating the old by way of force. And the second observation I would like to make is that refers to a particular battle here on the right that will be difficult to decipher unless you know Japanese. Here you have a rickshaw defeating the traditional means of conveyance in Japan, namely an ox cart. In other words, the rickshaw is seen as one of the elements of enlightened modernity. And in fact, the rickshaw was an invention of the 1870s in Japan. It was, for Japanese, as new and as modern as the brick buildings, as the gas lanterns in the Ginza district. The rickshaw embodied modernity in 1870s Japan. It embodied enlightenment in a way we would find difficult to recognize. Now, what does that mean? It means that we cannot take for granted what is seen as new, as civilized, as enlightened. But in fact, this is a very hybrid concept that changes depending on where you go and where you look. So in a nutshell, this is already much of the basic message I would like to bring across. And here's the preview of how I would like to structure the argument that I'm going to conduct. In the first part, I'll briefly summarize how historians until now have tried to place the Enlightenment in world history. I'll move on to an argument about the 18th century, where I claim that we need to understand Enlightenment in global synchronicity. And I'll move then to a third part where I extend the story and the career of the Enlightenment into the 19th century and try to trace its longer career and what that actually means for the concept. So let's start with part one, the Enlightenment in world history, and there are essentially three ways in which historians have understood the Enlightenment. The first one is easy. That's the standard narrative of at least European and North American textbooks. Europeans invented the Enlightenment and then benevolently disseminated it around the world. This view is very nicely summed up by Jürgen Osterhammel. The Enlightenment was a European phenomenon, he says, that had multifaceted effects around the world, but originated only in Europe. We have to face it, he says, the Age of Enlightenment was an epoch in the history of Europe, not in the history of the world. This book will come out in about 2 months, so just to let you know that this is not sort of a 1960s view, but this is actually state of the art. The opposing interpretation has held that the Enlightenment is not a benevolent gift of Europe to the world, but in fact it is the reverse. It is a form of cultural imperialism. And this, of course, refers to the strand of post-colonial thinking and post-colonial argument, by which the argument goes that the Enlightenment is the cause of much of the trouble and suppression in large parts of the world. And this is an argument that usually comes in 2 parts. First part, the argument goes, imperialism is in fact an effect of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is the origin, the cause, the crucial factor that explains imperialism, right? And with it, everything that goes wrong in modern history. In particular, it is universal. It is Enlightenment universalism that is seen by some as the core of the suppression of large parts of the world. Let me quote Ashish Nandi as a particular vociferous proponent. He says, the new forms of man-made violence unleashed by post-17th century Europe in the name of Enlightenment values have led not only to imperialism, but also to the Third Reich, the Gulag, the 2 world wars, and the threat of nuclear annihilation. All right, so this is the Enlightenment in the post-colonial reading, part one, because the second part of the argument goes whether or not Enlightenment caused imperialism. It is definitely clear that imperialism spread the Enlightenment values and through this process eliminated all kinds of other value systems, all kinds of alternative cosmologies around the world. It is this form of imperialism that we'll have to address and redress possibly. Now, both of these narratives begin with a European Enlightenment that then spreads out into the rest of the world. A third interpretation holds that this is probably not true. But in fact, there were multiple enlightenments around the world, and we've only failed to see them until now. We failed to recognize that there are enlightenments also in the Islamic world, in East Asia, in South Asia, and so forth. This is a challenge, an important challenge to the idea that large parts of the pre-modern world were stagnating, waiting until Napoleon or British imperialism actually came to energize these societies. And in fact, this strand of scholarship stresses the change, the dynamic character of many societies. And some historians have gone on to claim that there is something that we could call an enlightenment also, say, in the Islamic world. Reinhard Schulze, a historian in Bern, Switzerland, claims that there has been an Islamic enlightenment in the 18th century. Other historians have looked to Japan, to India, or to China, where Mark Elvin claims there is something like what Max Weber would have called a disenchantment of the world, a trend towards seeing fewer dragons and miracles. This is rationalization, the advent of reason that happens, he claims, in China independently and before actually the intensified contact with Europe. Now, this is a story by which we see multiple, if you will, parallel developments towards enlightenment, and a large part of the scholarship is very stimulating and exciting, but there is a tendency to read into these histories, into all these different histories, the similar and in fact the same development. That is, all these different societies, they aim for the same telos, they aim for some kind of capitalist modern society, and historians are busy discovering the Indian Vico and the Arab Rousseau in their traditions. And in fact, what this approach does is it neglects the fact that there were multiple ways of interlinkages, intercourse, exchange between societies, and instead this approach tends to construct sort of parallel stories that for some magic reason all end up in modernity. Now, to move beyond this, what I would suggest is to move into part one of my argument, and that is, part one is a claim in which I try to say that, in particular in Europe in the 18th century, if we talk about the European and the Atlantic Enlightenment in the 18th century, then this needs to be understood essentially as a response to challenges of living in a global world. So what kind of challenges am I talking about? In the 18th century, the travelogue was the preferred medium. That was the most important medium of exchange in early modern Europe. And Europeans looked at large parts of the world and understood their place in the world differently. They looked at places ranging from Polynesia to the American Indians in North America, to Africa, and in particular to China. China was idealized, seen as the most enlightened form of government, actually, in the 19th century. This is a well-known argument that European intellectuals refer to China as a model to go beyond the narrow confines of absolutist regimes in Europe. But this is only just one example. If we phrase this very generally, then we could say that most of the sciences of man, as they were discovered and developed in Europe in the 18th century, were actually responses to this situation of globality. So think of the debates about the character of man. Think of the debates about the law of nations in the wake of Hugo Grotius. Think of the new disciplines such as anthropology, ethnography, geography. All these were attempts to come to terms with Europe's place in the world. If you think about comparative literature and comparative linguistics, also two disciplines that strive in the late 18th century, if you think about the new discourse of race, if you think about the discourse of cosmopolitanism, all these discourses were attempts to place Europe in the larger world and to understand the way in which the world interacted. So I think it's not too far to say, it's not exaggerated to say that the whole landscape of knowledge production was reorganized in the latter half of the 18th century under the conditions of a newly discovered globality. And this is a globality, and this would be argument number 2, that is not only discovered and thought by Europeans, but it's actually one to which many actors in many places around the world contribute. This is an argument that draws on different scholarly fields. For example, in the history of science, it's increasingly recognized that the advances of European science were clearly not the work of Europeans alone, but dependent on many participants in different places of the world. So influentially, Kapil Raj has made the argument that many authors, many what used to be called informants, but what is now seen as individual contributors to a conversation, played a part in the advance of European and modern science. Important parts, he says, of what passes off as Western science were actually made outside the West. This is an argument and an insight that can easily be translated into the more philosophical and political language of the Enlightenment. Let's briefly look at where Enlightenment discussions reached in the 18th century. We can go from what is typically seen as its European and North American core, extend this to, say, Russia, where Tsar Catherine II fashioned herself, at least for a couple of decades, as an enlightened monarch. She invited Diderot to come to Russia, eventually found that the Enlightenment was not really what Russia needed, at least what she thought. We could go to Latin America, where people like Antonio Nariño in Bogotá, in today's Colombia, translated the French Declaration of Rights just a few years after it was published on his own printing press and engaged in an Enlightenment dialogue across the continent. We could move all the way to Mysore in South Asia, where Tipu Sultan founded the Jacobin Club, called himself Citoyen Tipu, and played and tinkered with the idea, fashioned himself as, again, a monarch of the Enlightenment. Now, this kind of synchronicity of Enlightenment debates and dialogues had an effect, I would claim, on what the Enlightenment was, on what we have to understand as the Enlightenment, and probably the place to go for this kind of argument would be the revolution in Haiti. As you know, the revolution in Haiti in some ways radicalized the claims of the Enlightenment. It radicalized the universalist claims that were formulated in Paris. And in other words, we can make a claim that in fact this global is probably too strong, but the transatlantic plus spread of Enlightenment debates enabled reformulations, changes, and actually a radicalization of what the Enlightenment meant. This is a quote from historian Laurent Dubois, who claims that the democratic possibilities, he says, imperial powers would claim they were bringing to the colonies had in fact been forged not within the boundaries of Europe, but through the struggles over rights that spread throughout the Atlantic empires. Now this addresses a whole literature about the Black Atlantic, the many-headed hydra, a couple of books that have appeared in the recent years, but the claim is mainly about Haiti, the claim namely that the revolution in Haiti radicalized the universalist claims that we associate with the Enlightenment. To be sure, the revolution in Haiti had many origins. It clearly was an effect, a product of structural conflicts in Haiti itself. It was also driven, however, by news that came over from France, by communication flows across the Atlantic. And it led to a formulation of the rights of man that challenged the philosophical and political assumptions of the French revolutionaries. Famously, as you know, in France, slaves were explicitly excluded from the rights of men. The Assemblée Nationale denied these rights to slaves, and Haiti, the event in Haiti, challenged these fundamental assumptions of the French Enlightenment. This kind of reformulation is a product, I would claim, of the forms of hybridization and the mobilization of multiple resources that is very typical for this process. That is, revolutionaries in Haiti were part of a complex transnational flow of information, of knowledge. Toussaint Louverture, for example, the leader of the Haiti revolt, himself was influenced by Raynal and also by Raynal's image of a black Spartacus who would one day rise and free the slaves. So it was clearly a way in which he interpreted and articulated French claims, quote unquote. But it's also true that more than 2/3 of the slaves who revolted in Haiti were actually born in West Africa. They were first-generation Haitians. They brought with them ideas, religious ideas, but also ideas of kingdom, of just government. And this complex mix of different ideas produced, under the conditions of inequality in Haiti, produced what was, in fact, the Haitian Revolution. So what we have here is a complex, it's a negotiation of different cultural resources, and this is, of course, a process that's very normal, that is normality in global history everywhere. So this would be argument number one. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment always implies a coming to terms with globality, and second, it is not made by Europeans alone, but has many authors that somehow contribute and as I said, in some ways modify and even radicalize claims that we associate with the Enlightenment. But can we actually write the history of the Enlightenment into the 19th century, or past 1800? This is something that historians have rarely done. In fact, all histories of the Enlightenment end in about 1800, if they don't end earlier. Jonathan Israel, today probably the most famous Enlightenment scholar, for him, Enlightenment ends in 1740. Everything that comes after that is just an aftermath. So what about the 19th century? My claim would be that there's a long history of the Enlightenment that we need to recognize, a longer history that actually contributes to what we should understand as the Enlightenment. And I'll come to the question that was already posed now, because immediately if you move beyond 1800, two questions will be on the table immediately. The first one would be to ask, well, can we really speak of the Enlightenment? And the second question would be, is this not essentially, after all, a history of diffusion? Is this not a history of something that has been formulated once and is then appropriated? Yes, modified maybe a little bit, but essentially it is a form of dissemination. Let's start with the first question. Can we really speak of the Enlightenment? Is it enlightenment itself? I would start by saying that this is a question that's probably wrongly put. It treats enlightenment as if it were a thing. But I would claim that it was a concept that was used to legitimize particular claims. It's not a thing that can be defined once and for all, but rather we have to look what people actually do with it. Or let me rephrase, enlightenment, the way I use it, is not an analytical concept, but rather I would prefer looking at how historical actors around the world actually used and deployed the concept to press for claims of their very own. And only if we look at the way in which people use Enlightenment can we actually understand what it meant. This would move us beyond a sort of a history of misunderstandings and derivatives, but rather to a history where we take seriously what people actually do with this concept. Yes, and I'm still with the question of the gentleman. Yes, there were various claims associated with the Enlightenment, but they were not indiscriminate. There was probably something that if we wanted to, we could call a core. Most people talked about some form of improvement in this world when they said Enlightenment. Most people also refer to reason vis-a-vis some kind of tradition that they didn't like. Most people also had the idea of some kind of emancipation. But if we look into concrete debates, almost anything could be related to the Enlightenment. People made claims for the abolishment of tariffs, for the institution of private property. People claimed that free love is really the pinnacle of the Enlightenment, or let's say the possibility for widows to remarry. People claimed that penal reform, national character, all that is an expression of Enlightenment. No, we could even go further. We could say department stores, the use of underwear, the use of a watch. All these are examples. This is what people claimed is Enlightenment. Almost anything that we said, says the Japanese reformer and enlightener, as he's called even today, Tsuda Mamichi, whenever we open our mouth, it is to speak of Enlightenment. And this is, in fact, in some ways modifies the way in which we typically understand Enlightenment. So take just for one example, the secularization idea. Most of us, at least in Europe, for that matter, tend to associate the Enlightenment with moving beyond religion, creating a secular society. Now for Tsuda, he says, there is no religion in the world today that promotes enlightenment as does Christianity. Now this would have been terrible news for someone like Voltaire or Diderot, and it would be anathema for someone like Jonathan Israel, but this was social reality in Japan in the 1870s. So yes, what we need to do when we chart the longer history of the Enlightenment is we have to look at the people who actually use the term, ask what they mean and why they use it. Now it's interesting to see that throughout the 19th century, these Enlightenment debates moved throughout Asia. Not at the same moment. There's a certain and very specific chronology. It's typically related to moments in which societies experience internal moments of crisis and conflict. And this moment of crisis is connected to European expansionism. So these two factors come together, and then Enlightenment enters the political vocabulary in many places. So we could look at, say, Bengal in the 1820s, where someone like Ramohun Roy, who is called by contemporaries a person who creates, they call it a religion of reason, engages with tenets of the Enlightenment under the pressures of British imperialism. In the Ottoman Empire, we have to probably move into the 1830s when the Tanzimat reforms begin, and then more specifically, a conversation with French texts begins in the 1850s. This is Namik Kemal, who refers to Locke and Rousseau in his own words. In his own works, he's called later by an Ottoman journalist the Voltaire of his nation. We can move on to Rifa al-Takhtawi in Egypt, who creates a whole school for the translation of European text, Enlightenment texts, for that matter, in the latter half of the 19th century. If we move into East Asia, we have to wait until the 1870s before in Japan an Enlightenment debate begins. In China and in Korea, this happens really only in the 1880s and 1890s. This is an image of Yan Fu, who translated important works ranging from Adam Smith to Montesquieu into Chinese. So there is a certain chronology that's linked to geopolitical processes. And this chronology also means that we have to register and come to terms with the fact that these formulations of Enlightenment happen at very different moments, right? So if you say Enlightenment in the 1830s, this is already a very different context from the 1780s. And of course, Enlightenment in the 1880s is again very different from the 1830s. In fact, the history of Enlightenment is over time fused with other strands of thinking and of thought. In particular with liberalism, with ideas, if you know, think of the work of someone like James Mill, but then Darwinism, Spencer. Over time, these ideas, Darwinism and social Darwinism in particular, are fused with Enlightenment thinking or Enlightenment debates in ways that definitely change what people understand and mean when they say Enlightenment, right? This is, of course, I mean, just in brackets, this is not something that is true only for, say, Asia. In fact, this happens in Europe just the same. Also in Europe in the later 18th century, in the latter half of the 19th century, when people say Enlightenment, they mean something that's very different from the later 18th century. They actually use Enlightenment increasingly, I would say, as a measure, as a yardstick by which to measure and gauge different societies. So Enlightenment increasingly becomes something that a nation or a society has more of or less of. And if you're happy enough to have more of it, then you're entitled to intervene everywhere else and give freely, right? In other words, imperialism is one of the consequences. But the idea that Enlightenment is a measurement that helps to position your society within global contexts is even more remarked and even more pronounced outside of Europe. This is a quote from a Korean newspaper at the turn of the century. And if you read this brief quote, it's immediately clear that, first of all, Enlightenment is a universal yardstick, but also it means that Enlightenment is clearly not seen as the possession of, say, Europeans or Americans alone. In fact, Koreans were more enlightened in earlier times. They are now lagging behind, but you can imagine that in the future, again, they will be leading. So the Enlightenment is seen definitely as a universal standard that everyone can use, and it's only a temporary advantage that the European countries experience. The Enlightenment, in other words, is a way to think globally, and it's a way to come to terms with the large processes that integrate and unite the globe at the time, namely the integration of the world economy, the international state system, and imperialism. But what I find interesting is that if we look at these debates, it's very clear to see that when people say Enlightenment, they actually address these three processes and try to sort of mediate these processes by the term Enlightenment. Let's take a brief look. So on the one hand, many commentators, they talk about Enlightenment as being all about a regime of free trade, the opening of ports, property, the liberation of customs. It's also the production of a diligent workforce, the enlightenment of the populace, the creation of a diligent workforce. The whole rhetoric of the Enlightenment in the 19th century is one that strives to make societies enter a world of an integrated global capitalism. Second, the rhetoric of the Enlightenment, much of it is about railroading, as it were, the populace into the logic of the nation state, creating a civilized, enlightened, and improved population that understands itself as a nation. This is a process, this is a rhetoric that is directed at the lower classes within societies. It's also directed vis-a-vis other powers, in particular toward of imperialist aspirations. The claim, namely, that our society, our population is enlightened, is the best argument against, on the discursive level at least, against imperialist encroachments. And also, imperialism enters the rhetoric and the vocabulary of the Enlightenment. Clearly, there's probably no better example to illustrate this than the Japanese enlightener, Fukuzawa Yukichi. And this is what he has to say. He says, "To plan our course now, our country cannot afford to wait for the enlightenment of our neighbors and to cooperate in building Asia up. Rather, we should leave their ranks to join the camp of the civilized countries of the West. Even when dealing with China and Korea, we need not have special scruples simply because they are our neighbors, but should behave towards them as the Westerners do, or as enlightened powers do, you could say. One who befriends an evil person cannot avoid being involved in his notoriety. In spirit, then, we break with our evil friends of Eastern Asia." In other words, to be enlightened, to be civilized means this is there's the command to colonize, right? That goes with it immediately. Now, what this means, I mean, these three levels of engaging a globalizing world mean that to speak of enlightenment means at the end of the 19th century to engage with a complex world, a globalizing world, and try to make this world legible by this one universal yardstick. Now, the term, in other words, the term has been transformed over the course of the 19th century. And I would argue that this transformation is crucial for our understanding of enlightenment. It's a term that's less used to describe the rights of an individual vis-a-vis a nation state. It's more used as a description that actually addresses a society, a nation, a collective, and is seen as a term that positions a collective in the larger global context. Now, this is, I think, what conceptual history should be about, and this is also what Reinhard Koselleck, one of the champions of conceptual history, has to say. In the dense words of a German academic, every reading, he says, by later generations of past conceptualizations alters the spectrum of possible transmitted meanings. The original contexts of concepts change, so too do the original or subsequent meanings carried by concepts. In other words, if it is phrased again and again in very different contexts, then the term itself and the concept changes with it. We cannot sort of write this off as a history that is only a PS, a postscriptum, or a form of misunderstanding. Let's move finally to the second question that we still have in mind. Is this, after all, really more than a history of diffusion? And I would say no, it isn't. It is actually a history of the constant reinvention of the Enlightenment, the global co-production, if you will, of Enlightenment debates. And this is so because, this is so, if I generalize, mainly for two reasons. One of them would be that in most of these discussions, actually a whole variety of cultural resources are mobilized and enter this discussion. So, for example, Ramohun Roy, when he uses Enlightenment terms, he always refers to Hindu and Muslim traditions, but also makes references to, for example, the national liberation movement in Latin America. If you think about Fukuzawa, whom we have just encountered, he writes his history of the world in a metrical pattern that is reminiscent of Buddhist catechisms to make it sort of bleed into Japanese traditions. But it's probably Confucianism that is used most frequently as a resource that feeds into Enlightenment debates. Now, this is actually, this is very counterintuitive. In fact, at the beginning, Enlightenment debates were all about in East Asia, were all about discarding the Confucian tradition, to move beyond sort of a narrow, stubborn Confucian tradition that refused to open China, Korea, Japan, and so forth to the rest of the world. But what actually happens is that Confucianism is not relegated to the dustbin of history, but is rather used and mobilized as an additional resource to make this new way of thinking this new discourse palatable and acceptable. This is just an example. This is the term. This is the character for in Japan. In Japan, it's read ri. It's an older Confucian character that usually denotes the order and harmony of society. In Confucian thinking, this is a very rather rigid, let's call it paternalistic, in some ways authoritarian form of ordering society. Now this character, ri, is used then in the 1870s and 80s as the term that translates the principle of laissez-faire and even of market exchange. So when people read this character, they understand market exchange, and laissez-faire, but at the same time, this character also holds the connotations of the older Confucian order. It is the character that determines the way in which things move according to what someone like Adam Smith would have called the invisible hand. There are other examples, all kinds of other examples. Take, for example, Liu Shipei, a Chinese intellectual philosopher who in 1903 writes he calls his book A Chinese Social Contract, and argues that whatever Rousseau said was thought of in China many centuries ago. So the real Rousseau is actually to be found in the Chinese tradition, and it's only now, Western imperialism only brings a message that the Chinese had known all along. Now this is, of course, in some ways a strategic move, but at the same time, it also changes the way in which people understand Enlightenment. It's a term that's less used in China and in Japan at the time, less used for a particular form of individualism, but rather as something that's closer to logics that refer to a collective or a larger social whole. The second argument I would make here is that enlightened concepts in the 19th century were increasingly wrestled from their sole attachment to Europe. That is, increasingly, the reference was made not only to Hume and Locke and Montesquieu and Voltaire, but rather to other forms of what people then considered Enlightenment. Again, I could give you many different examples, but probably the case that is most obvious would be Japan after 1905. After the victory over China in 1895 and then the victory over Russia in 1905, Japan promises enlightened modernity without Western imperialism. And in many countries, ranging from the Ottoman Empire all the way to East Asia, intellectuals and reformers hope for, if you will, some kind of inspiration or look to Japan as a model for their kind of modernization or enlightenment. Just two brief examples. One of them is Yoon Kil-chun, the most famous Korean enlightener in the 1890s, who first travels to Japan, studies with Fukuzawa Yukichi, and then realizes, well, this is not the real thing. I have to travel to the West, and he actually makes his way all the way to the United States, comes back to Korea, and writes a big book about what the Enlightenment actually means. He really turns enlightenment into sort of an everyday word in Korea. Now, the book makes every effort to efface every Japanese trace in this narrative, but in fact, the book is almost, I wouldn't say a copy, but it's very closely modeled after Fukuzawa's own book. In fact, it's printed in Japan because at the time there were no printing presses in Korea that used Hangul scripts. So it was difficult to avoid in East Asia in the late 19th century the Japanese referent of Enlightenment. Another example, the last one I have, is Liang Qichao, the famous Chinese intellectual and nationalist, who travels after his own failed coup d'etat in 1898. He's exiled, travels to Japan, and he says, my eyes are opened. Books like I've never seen before dazzle my eyes. Ideas like I've never encountered before baffle my brain. It is like seeing the sun after being confined in a dark room. I mean, the whole rhetoric, the dark room, the light. This is Enlightenment. Japan brings Enlightenment not only to Liang Qichao, but then to China. He eventually moves back to China, creates a large translation bureau. More than 1,000 works until 1911. 1,000 works are translated from Japanese into Chinese, and they bring Enlightenment modernity to Chinese intellectuals. They, what is more, they actually bring the conceptual vocabulary, because pretty much every modern term, ranging from science to nation to society, to labor, to equality, to capitalism, and so forth and so forth. All these new social science terms are introduced to China by way of detour through Japan. In other words, Japanese versions of these terms are then introduced into China. Chinese Enlightenment, if you will, it does not only refer to Europe, but it refers to Japan, whether it wants to or not. It is not a European genealogy alone, in other words, and one of the appeals of the Japanese detour was that Japan promised advantages, as Liang Qichao was quick to recognize. It promised a shortcut because it was easier to read Japanese text than to bother with all this French and English stuff. But also, it promised, if you will, a modified, we could even say, an Asianized version of enlightened modernity that was easier to negotiate with social conditions in China in around 1900. So my overall claim, to reiterate, would be to say that the Enlightenment in the 19th century is made by social groups in places like Manila, in Seoul, in Shanghai, who refer to French texts, but they respond to conditions of their own place and time. The Enlightenment, in other words, is not a script that's out there and then is sort of reenacted, impersonated by people on stages in places far away from Paris, but rather needs to be seen as the product of engaged intellectuals, reformers, or larger parts of the population in places, say in Seoul in the 1890s, and what they do, when they say Enlightenment, then they respond to the conditions of Korea in the 1890s, and they don't respond primarily to Voltaire, right? So this is, I think, the way in which we need to reread this longer history of the Enlightenment, different from a history that William McNeill, in the first slide that I showed, gave us. Yeah, this is basically it, so a brief concluding slide. This is what I try to say. One, the Enlightenment itself, that's interesting to see, was obsessed with questions of origins. Enlightenment thinkers from Condorcet to Rousseau inquired into the European origins, into the origins of almost anything and everything, the origins of man, the origins of reason, the origins of law, the origins of language. These were these were crucial and primary concerns of Enlightenment thinkers. Now, the ironic thing is that historians of the Enlightenment are reproducing, if you will, this strategy. And they're asking, if they ask a question about the Enlightenment, it is the question of origins. Was it European? And then was its dissemination good or bad? If it wasn't, do we have origins in the Arab world? Do we have origins in southern India? Do we have origins of the Enlightenment in China? My claim is this obsession we need to discard. We need to move beyond the obsession with origins. It's an obsession of many historians more generally. We need to move away from origins to the history of the concept and also of the practice. In fact, the Enlightenment had a history, and this history mattered. This is the claim that I primarily want to make. It's a history that matters and that actually transforms the way that we should read and understand the Enlightenment. And this is in three ways. First, and this is only going back to what I said initially, the Enlightenment has always been an attempt to come to terms with global challenges, with the challenge of living in an increasingly interconnected world. Second, the Enlightenment has not been the work of the French philosophe alone, but rather has been the the result of the co-production of knowledge by many authors. To be sure, under very different conditions, under conditions of geopolitical inequality, under hierarchies of imperialism. But under these conditions, it is still a process of entanglements and not a process of dissemination. And third, we need to seriously rethink the temporality and the spatiality of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, to think about the time frame, we could easily extend, and I think we need to extend, the history of the Enlightenment into the 19th century at the very least. And also we need to rethink the space of the Enlightenment because it was really a global story. And this also could prompt us or invite us to rethink the very notion of the universal that is so famously associated with the Enlightenment. Because if the universal is not something that somebody thinks of and conceives and is then by way of of its inherent convincing character adopted by everyone else, but rather, as we have seen, is a process by which people around the world use, transform, modify, and then employ this term, then the story of universalism has to be rethought and reconfigured. It is, in fact, the story of something that becomes global in practice rather than the story of a promise that is inherently universal because some early modern genius, again to quote McNeill, has concocted it originally. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the lecture. You talked about how Enlightenment perhaps isn't a purely European invention, and then you had some slides, Raja Rammohan Rao, and then from Japan and Korea. But I'm wondering, were there many examples of a reciprocal movement? Mm-hmm. Yes, mm-hmm. Enough
Okay.
responses here, but what about from here towards France or Paris or Europe?
Right. Okay. Yeah, a very good question. I mean, again, we would need more time. I would say, on the one hand, yes. The Haiti example would be the strongest case, where you clearly can see. So, in 1791, the French decide the slaves are not part of humanity, so forget it. Then the Haitians revolt. A few years later, in 1794, the Assemblée Nationale is forced to acknowledge that, yes, the rights of man actually extend to the slaves as well. So there's an immediate response, an immediate sort of repercussion, if you will. So I think, yes, that part of the story is clearly visible. The second part of the story is more about, my argument would less be about, I'm less interested in, let's say, measuring or weighing influences back and forth to who has more to give, who has more to offer. Rather, my interest would be to see when someone uses the term, he or she does that under conditions of globality. Which means, yes, if you're in Calcutta in the 1820s, you can make reference to French philosophes, but it doesn't mean that you're influenced by them or driven or sort of determined by what they have to say. But rather, you use and appropriate what they say under specific conditions of your own. But to extend that argument, this is also true if in Prussia in the 1870s, you say, the liberal state is an enlightened state. We need to drive out the Catholics out of office. We need to civilize the natives in Africa. Also then, if people say enlightenment, they do that under conditions of a perceived globality. So that would be my main argument. In other words, the brief answer is, yes, there are flows back and forth. But if you want to measure, there's no doubt that there are more references to France and Utrecht and Naples than the references to Seoul and Shanghai and Manila. There's no doubt, but this only reflects the conditions of imperialist geopolitics in the 19th century.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation and a lot of concepts put forward. But don't you think, or maybe you would consider that the Enlightenment, from its perspective of, say, Ibn Khaldun is essentially a continuum where there are bursts in activity in terms of mankind, in terms of acquiring knowledge and then disseminating. So if we go back to Baghdad and the Abbasid period, when there was Dar al-Hikmah, and there was translations. You talked about translation of 1,000 books in China, but we're talking about a lot more books being translated during that period, then being disseminated through the Abbasid Empire, and then later on, that information finding its way in Islamic Spain, in Cordoba, and at that period of time, you had more books in Cordoba than the whole of France. There was lighting as well, and that information then permeates through to Europe as well, also through different interactions through the Crusades and whatever. So really, is this Enlightenment part 3 rather than just the beginning?
Okay.
Thank you.
Very good question. Very good point. Thank you. I mean, that's a very important comment to make, I think. Yes, I think you could write such a history, there's no doubt. It would be, the part of the history that you alluded to now is also a history of interchange and intercourse, translation and communication. Now, it is not the kind of story I would tell, though. In other words, yes, I think it's a valid story, but my narrative begins with people who self-consciously think that when they say Enlightenment, that they're different from everything that came before. Now, whether that was actually the case is sort of a different point, but I think for the story that I'm interested in telling, it's important that these people believe, in Europe, but also in these other parts of the world that I mentioned, that these people believe that the difference between everything that's dark and traditional and their age is a crucial difference. And therefore, they need to reiterate that term. They need to cling on to that term in order to survive. This is, of course, a different story, but my story is a story also of the concept, of the terminology employed, and I think that is a crucial one.
So my question is, do you think the Enlightenment thinkers, ideas have an effect on governments today?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, they can have an effect on governments today. Do they by themselves? No. They do when a strong force within government or a strong oppositional or reformist force makes claims. And the typical way to make these claims today is to refer to the Enlightenment. It gives specific claims. Mostly people don't say these are Enlightenment values because they have read Voltaire. It's rather because the term Enlightenment gives credence and legitimation, global legitimation, if you will, to particular claims and demands. So if this is why I say, the large exhibition just a couple of years ago, 2 years maybe, in Shanghai on the Enlightenment was such a politicized event. Not because that story really generates conflict, but rather because it's linked to these agendas of current reformers and politicians. So there's no inherent power in these words and terms. It's only when they're linked to claims and movements. But then I think it imbues very specific demands with a global form of legitimacy that is what is so powerful about it, and what has been so powerful throughout the story that I tried to tell.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for such an enlightening presentation.
Okay.
Your conclusion, enlightenment as the co-production of knowledge by many authors. I think it's very important to me, and I really like where you're going with this. I think, as my friend mentioned, the idea of kind of trying to map the conceptual genealogy of the history of ideas and the dialogical relationship with the history of ideas is kind of difficult within itself. But my concern has to do with the implications of your work having to do with what we do in the classroom. Often as professors trying to teach the Enlightenment, in most cases, the literature is not available yet that kind of delineates the contribution of those other authors, which allows us, because I'm concerned about the notion of the Enlightenment as a kind of discourse, a tool, and instrumentalizing the tool that ends up privileging the Enlightenment, i.e. Europe, over other civilizations and their development. So we see a positive literature about the notion of what is happening in these other places in terms of the Enlightenment, because it becomes kind of a discursive kind of hegemony, and that's kind of a hard word to say, but to say it, but that's a concern that I have about in the classroom and students and what we're doing and teaching them.
Okay, very good question. I mean, in some ways linked to the earlier question, the Abbasid question, if I may call it that. Yes, and maybe it's maybe my answer would be it's two different projects, really. I mean, so what I try to do, you're right, this has to do with some kind of discursive hegemony that is difficult to avoid if you look at the 19th century. Now, yes, we can still recognize the contributions of different authors, but much of it happens within some kind of framework that most of them see as established. If we were to write a larger, more global history of, maybe I'll just use a different term to make it clear that these are two different projects, of modernity, then we would have to look at the contributions, the ones that you mentioned, and then I would refer to this larger debate about early modernities that is now emerging in many places. This debate about early modernity is again one that's not without its problems, but there's a lot of stimulus. It's very interesting, very exciting work coming out on many places. And of course, if you think about what a typical Enlightenment thinker would have said was modern, he would have said it starts with Enlightenment, and he would have said, it's hegemony of reason. If we think today what defines modernity, it would be some kind of capitalism would probably come into the picture, some kind of moving beyond tradition, some kind of organization of society according to something that you could call some kind of collective consciousness, not to call it nationalism, and so forth and so forth. Now, if you use these traits as a checklist, yes, then probably Sung China would be one of the first enlightened and modern countries. So in other words, if you want to trace that story, I think we have to go a different route. That was not my project today, but I think it's a very important and absolutely crucial project. And in the classroom, I think these are the questions and these are the cases that we need to look at. And I think that the concept of early modernity as a heuristic concept helps us to actually put that on the table and discuss it.